Some losses carve so deep they change the shape of a man's soul. Eli Murdock knew this truth better than most. Having buried his dreams alongside his wife in the hard prairie ground 20 years past. At nearly 60, he lived alone in his hand-built cabin, miles from the nearest neighbor. The silence had become his companion, filling days that once overflowed with laughter and shared plans for the family they'd never have. Then she appeared at his door, a woman wrapped in furs, her eyes holding mysteries. Without ceremony, she spoke words that shook him to his core. "I was told you're alone. Let me give you children, man." These weren't just any words. They echoed something his late wife had written in her journal, words he'd never shared with another soul. How did this stranger know his deepest secret? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin stood as testament to patience and devotion, each log hand-hewn, each stone carefully placed. Eli had built it over the course of 3 summers, back when his hands were steadier and his heart fuller. Sarah had stood beside him through every stage, holding boards while he hammered, mixing mortar while he laid foundation stones. They'd planned each room with the children they would have, a nursery facing east to catch the morning sun, a kitchen large enough for family meals that would stretch long into evening hours. Now the morning light fell empty across those same floors, illuminating dust motes that danced alone in spaces meant for laughter. Eli stood at his kitchen window, watching the woman who called herself Clara work in his neglected garden. 3 days had passed since her arrival, and she'd settled into the rhythm of his land as if she'd always belonged there. Her movements held purpose, not the frantic energy of youth, but the measured efficiency of someone who understood the value of each gesture. She knelt among the withered tomato plants, her strong hands gentle as she cleared away the season's failures. The morning sun caught threads of silver in her dark hair, pulled back in a practical braid that spoke of mountain living and hard-earned wisdom. Everything about her suggested capability, the way she tested soil with her fingertips, the practiced manner in which she coaxed life from seemingly dead earth. "You're letting good ground go to waste," she'd told him that first morning. Not unkindly, but with the directness of someone unaccustomed to dancing around truth. A man's got to eat more than beans and hardtack if he wants to see another winter. Eli had wanted to tell her he hadn't much cared about seeing another winter. Not for years now. But something in her tone, matter of fact rather than pitying, had kept the words locked away. Now he watched her work and felt something stir in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to recognize: hope. It had been so long since he'd felt it that the emotion seemed foreign, like a half-remembered song from childhood. The coffee in his cup had gone cold while he stood there, lost in observation. Clara rose from the garden, brushing soil from her hands, and looked directly at his window. Even from this distance he could see her slight smile, not mocking but understanding, as if she knew exactly what effect her presence was having on his carefully ordered solitude. She'd appeared 3 evenings ago, just as the sun touched the western horizon, emerging from the prairie grass like something conjured from his deepest longings. No horse, no wagon, just a woman walking out of the endless expanse with a leather pack on her shoulders and secrets in her eyes. "Evening," she'd said, as casual as if they'd been neighbors for years. "I'm looking for Eli Murdock." You found him. He'd kept his rifle within easy reach, but something about her stance, respectful rather than threatening, had kept his hand away from the trigger. "Good. I was told you're alone here. Let me give you children, man." The words had hit him like a physical blow, not because they were inappropriate, though they certainly were, but because they echoed with impossible familiarity. Sarah's journal, hidden in their bedroom trunk, contained those exact words in her careful script. A prayer, or maybe a wish, written during one of her darkest moments when the emptiness of their childless home had pressed down like a physical weight. But Sarah had been dead 20 years, and he'd never shared those private words with another living soul. "I don't know what game you're playing," he'd managed to say, "but no game. Her voice carried the rough music of mountain winds and distant places. "Just a woman with time on her hands and a man who looks like he could use some help." She gestured toward his sagging fence line, his overgrown garden, the general air of neglect that had settled over his property like dust over abandoned furniture. All true observations, but somehow she'd made them without judgment, as if she were simply noting weather conditions. "I don't need help." "Maybe not. But you're getting it anyway." She'd shouldered her pack and walked toward his barn, as if she owned the place. "I'll sleep out here tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk about putting this land back to rights." He should have ordered her off his property. Should have made it clear that whatever scheme she was running, whatever con she was working, he wasn't interested. Instead, he'd stood there like a fool while she made herself comfortable in his barn, spreading a bedroll in the hay with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making temporary homes. That had been 3 days ago. 3 days of watching her move through his space, organizing chaos he'd grown comfortable living with, preparing meals that reminded him food could be more than mere fuel. She asked for nothing, expected nothing, but somehow filled needs he hadn't even realized he still carried. The rational part of his mind insisted this was temporary. People didn't just appear from nowhere with offers to transform your life. There would be a price eventually. There always was. But the part of him that had been slowly dying in this empty house whispered that maybe, just maybe, some miracles came without strings attached. Clara had finished with the garden and was walking toward the house, her step easy despite the morning's work. Eli turned away from the window, busying himself with the pretense of cleaning his already clean rifle. He heard her boots on the porch steps, the creak of the door as she let herself in with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged. "Found something interesting," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him. She placed a small object on the table between them, a pressed wildflower, brittle with age, but still recognizable as Indian paintbrush. Eli's breath caught. He knew that flower, knew the careful hand that had preserved it. Sarah had kept a collection of pressed flowers, each one marking some significant moment in their marriage. Their first spring in the cabin, their first successful harvest, the day they'd decided to stop hoping for children and simply enjoy the life they had. "Where did you find this?" "Tucked in the corner of the garden shed, wrapped in oilcloth." Clara's fingers traced the delicate petals with reverence. "Someone took care preserving it. Someone who understood that memories need tending same as gardens do." The simple observation carried weight that pressed against Eli's carefully constructed defenses. For 20 years, he'd avoided that garden shed, unable to face the tools Sarah had used, the small touches that made even utilitarian spaces feel like home. Now this stranger had found something he'd forgotten existed, handled it with the same gentle care Sarah would have shown. "That was my wife's," he said quietly. "I figured as much." She had good taste. Indian paintbrush only blooms for a few weeks and only in the right conditions. Takes patience to catch it at just the right moment. Clara set the flower carefully aside. She must have understood that beauty's worth preserving, even when it seems like it might not last. The words settled between them, like stones dropped in still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond their surface meaning. Eli found himself studying Clara's face, noting the lines around her eyes that spoke of squinting into mountain distances. The calloused hands that knew hard work, the way she held herself, straight-backed but not rigid, strong but not harsh. "You never told me your full name," he said. "Clara's enough for now." She rose from the table, the pressed flower disappearing into her pocket with practiced care. "Names carry weight, and I'm not sure you're ready for the whole truth just yet. What's that supposed to mean?" But she was already moving toward the door, leaving him with questions and the lingering scent of sage and mountain air. At the threshold, she paused, looking back with eyes that seemed older than her face. "Your wife knew things, Eli, about loneliness, about the kind of emptiness that eats at a person from inside. But she also knew about hope, about the possibility that sometimes the thing you need most comes from the direction you least expect." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that Clara, whoever she truly was, had read Sarah's journal with the same careful attention she'd given to preserving that single, precious flower. The afternoon stretched ahead, empty as always, but somehow different now. The silence no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it hummed with possibility, with the promise that change, real, lasting change, might be more than just a fool's hope. Outside, Clara had returned to the garden, but now she was singing softly, a melody he didn't recognize, but that seemed to belong to this place, this moment, this unexpected intersection of past and present. For the first time in 20 years, Eli Murdock allowed himself to wonder what tomorrow might bring. The confrontation came on the fourth morning, when Eli found Clara sitting at his kitchen table with Sarah's journal open before her, reading with the absorbed attention of someone discovering familiar ground. "That's private." His voice carried 20 years of protective anger. Clara looked up without guilt or apology, her finger marking her place on the page. She wrote beautifully. "Honest words about hard things. You have no right. Sometimes I wonder if Eli blames me for our empty house." Clara read aloud, her voice gentle but unwavering. "He never says so, but I see it in his eyes when he looks at other men's children. The ache I feel must be written on his face when he looks at me." Eli's hands clenched at his sides. Those words had been Sarah's private torment, never spoken aloud, but poured onto paper during her darkest hours. Hearing them in a stranger's voice felt like violation of the most sacred kind. "Stop. I dream sometimes of a woman coming to this house, someone strong enough to give him what I cannot. I would welcome her if such a person existed. I would step aside gladly if it meant Eli could know the joy of children before he's too old to teach them how to work this land he loves." The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of Sarah's mantel clock. Eli stared at Clara, his anger warring with something deeper and more complex. Those weren't just words from Sarah's journal. They were the exact sentiment behind that first shocking declaration Clara had made. The wish for someone to fill the emptiness, to bring life where there had been only loss. Clara closed the journal with careful reverence, her fingers trailing over the worn leather cover. Around her neck, barely visible above her simple dress, hung a silver locket that caught the morning light with each breath she took. "How long have you been watching me?" Eli asked quietly. "Long enough to know you're a good man carrying too much guilt." Clara's directness had an edge now, as if his accusation had cut deeper than intended. "Long enough to understand why she worried about you being alone. She's been dead 20 years. Whatever you think you know about my life, about what I need, I know about loss." Clara's voice sharpened. "I know about lying awake in empty houses, counting all the ways you failed someone you loved. I know about the kind of loneliness that makes you forget what it feels like to have purpose." She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the garden she'd been restoring. The silver locket shifted against her collarbone, and for a moment, Eli caught a glimpse of what looked like a photograph inside, too brief and distant to make out details, but enough to confirm it held something precious. "I was a midwife once," Clara said to the glass. "Brought more babies into this world than I can count. Held mothers through their hardest hours, celebrated new life, mourned the ones that didn't make it." Her reflection wavered slightly. "Then came a night when everything went wrong. A mother died because I wasn't skilled enough, fast enough, careful enough. Her baby lived 3 days before following her into whatever comes after." Eli felt his anger cooling, replaced by recognition of shared pain. Everyone carried losses, but some wounds ran deeper than others. After that, I couldn't bear to touch another laboring woman. Couldn't trust my hands not to fail again. Clara turned from the window, her face composed, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. "So I walked away. Took to the mountains, lived among people who didn't expect me to save lives I wasn't worthy of saving. That's why you disappeared. That's why I ran. The correction carried weight. Spent 15 years hiding from what I was, what I'd failed to be, until I started hearing stories about a man who'd built something beautiful with his wife, lost her, and was slowly letting everything they'd created fall to ruin. The pieces began to align in Eli's mind, forming a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see complete. Someone told you about me. Someone who knew Sarah when she was young. Someone who remembered her kindness to women who had children when she couldn't. Clara's hand moved unconsciously to her locket. Someone who thought maybe two broken people might be able to make something whole. Before Eli could ask who that someone was, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. Multiple riders, moving with purpose rather than casual travel. Clara's posture shifted immediately, her mountain-trained senses alert to potential danger. You expecting company? Never. Eli moved to his rifle, checking the load out of long habit. Through the window, he could see 3 men on horseback, well-dressed in a way that suggested money and city influence. Not the rough clothing of local ranchers or the practical gear of traveling merchants. The lead rider dismounted with the confident ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Middle-aged, soft around the middle but sharp in the eyes, wearing a black suit that had seen better days but still carried authority. His companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually but meaningfully on their sidearms. "Mr. Murdock?" The man's voice carried East Coast refinement, poorly masked by attempted Western directness. "Name's Thompson. I represent certain business interests that have taken notice of your property." Eli stepped onto his porch, rifle held low but visible. "My property's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Mr. Murdock. It's just a matter of finding the right price." Thompson's smile was practiced and empty. "This land you're sitting on, it's got potential. Right kind of development could bring prosperity to this whole region." Development. The word tasted sour in Eli's mouth. He'd seen what development meant. Towns that sprang up overnight around mining claims or railroad stops, full of people looking to get rich quick and move on, leaving nothing but scars on the landscape. Progress. "Mr. Murdock, hotels, maybe a railway spur. Facilities for folks coming west to see the frontier." Thompson gestured broadly at the rolling prairie. All this empty space could be put to better use than one man's farming operation. From inside the house, Eli heard Clara moving quietly, her footsteps deliberate. She'd be positioning herself where she could see the confrontation but stay out of immediate danger. Mountain wisdom applied to plains threats. "I said it's not for sale. Current offers generous, more than generous for land this remote." Thompson reached into his jacket, producing an envelope thick with papers. "But generosity has limits, Mr. Murdock. Sometimes circumstances change in ways that make a man reconsider his position." The threat was politely wrapped, but unmistakable. Eli's grip tightened on his rifle, muscle memory from his military days responding to the subtle menace in Thompson's tone. "I think you gentlemen should move along." "Oh, we will. But we'll be back." Thompson remounted with practiced ease. "Think about our offer, Mr. Murdock. Think real hard. Because men your age, living alone out here, accidents happen. Fires start. Sometimes help arrives too late." The riders wheeled their horses and departed at an easy lope, raising dust that hung in the still air like a lingering threat. Eli remained on the porch until they disappeared beyond the nearest rise. His soldier's instincts cataloguing details, weapons carried, horses' condition, the way they moved together like men accustomed to working as a unit. Clara emerged from the house, her face grim but unsurprised. "You've seen them before," Eli said. It wasn't a question. Their type, men who take what they want and call it business. She studied the horizon where the riders had vanished. "They'll be back, and next time they won't be so polite. Let them come. This is my land. Your land, maybe. But what about your life?" Clara turned to face him fully, and he saw something in her expression he hadn't noticed before. Protectiveness, fierce and uncompromising. "What about everything Sarah helped you build here?" The mention of his wife's name in this context felt different now, less like intrusion and more like invocation. As if Clara understood that defending this place meant defending not just property, but memory. Not just land, but love made manifest in wood and stone. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. This isn't your fight. Clara's laugh was short and sharp. Maybe not, but running away from fights is how I spent the last 15 years. Her hand moved again to her locket, a gesture becoming more familiar. Maybe it's time I remembered how to stand and fight for something worth saving. She stepped closer, and Eli caught the scent of sage and something else, something wild and clean like mountain snow. Her eyes, when she looked directly at him, held depths he was only beginning to fathom. Besides, she said softly, Sarah wouldn't forgive me if I let them destroy what you built together. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara's knowledge of Sarah went beyond reading a journal, beyond casual observation. There was intimacy in her understanding, connection that suggested history Eli didn't yet comprehend. But before he could ask the questions forming in his mind, Clara was moving again, her practical nature reasserting itself. "We'll need supplies," she said briskly. "More ammunition, food that'll keep, anything that might be useful if they decide to make this difficult." She paused at the door. "And I'll need to send word to some people. Let them know what's happening here." "What people?" Clara's smile was mysterious and slightly fierce. "People who remember what it means to protect family, even when that family isn't bound by blood." She disappeared into the house, leaving Eli alone on the porch with his thoughts and the growing realization that his quiet, solitary life was about to become something far more complicated and dangerous than he'd ever intended. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt truly alive. His heart beating with purpose beyond mere survival. The silver locket had caught his attention again in those final moments, and something about it nagged at his memory. A shape, a reflection, something familiar yet impossible to place. Whatever secrets Clara carried, whatever connection she had to Sarah and to him, he sensed he was about to discover truths that would change everything he thought he knew about his past and his future. The ride to town took most of the morning, with Clara seated beside him on the wagon bench, as if they'd been making this journey together for years. She'd dressed more carefully today, a clean blue dress that brought out her eyes, her hair braided with small wildflowers tucked into the weave. Not vanity, Eli realized, but armor. A woman alone faced enough challenges. A woman who looked like she belonged somewhere, who carried herself with quiet dignity, might find easier passage through suspicious minds. "Tell me about Martha," Clara said, as they crested the rise that brought Millfield into view. The town stretched below them, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street, surrounded by the kind of careful cultivation that spoke of people determined to make civilization bloom in stubborn soil. Martha Henley, been the town's midwife for near 30 years, delivered half the children in 3 counties. Eli guided the horses toward the general store, noting the way conversations seemed to pause as they passed. "Good woman. Lost her husband to consumption 5 years back, but she never let grief slow her down," Clara nodded, her eyes taking in everything with the careful attention of someone reading a landscape for signs of welcome or warning. "She'll remember me." The certainty in her voice made Eli glance sideways at her profile. "You've met?" "Long time ago. Before I took to the mountains." Clara's fingers worried at something in her pocket. That pressed flower from Sarah's collection, Eli realized. She'd been carrying it like a talisman. "We didn't part on the best of terms." Before Eli could ask for details, they'd reached their destination. The general store's porch was occupied by the usual collection of old-timers who seemed to exist primarily to observe and comment on the comings and goings of their neighbors. Their conversation died as Clara stepped down from the wagon, replaced by the kind of studied silence that meant rapid mental cataloging was taking place. "Eli Murdock," called out Jake Morrison, a leather-faced rancher whose spread bordered Eli's to the north. "Heard you had some visitors yesterday. City types asking questions about property values." News traveled fast in small communities, especially when that news involved potential threats to the established order. Eli nodded grimly. "They made their intentions clear. Made threats too, from what I hear." This from Sam Cartwright, whose general store served as unofficial headquarters for local gossip. "That Thompson fellow was in here not an hour ago asking about your..." domestic arrangements. The euphemism was delivered with the kind of delicacy that managed to be both tactful and pointed. Every eye on the porch had settled on Clara, taking in her composed bearing and the way she stood close enough to Eli to suggest partnership without quite crossing the line into impropriety. "Clara's been helping with the property," Eli said evenly. "Gardens never looked better, I'm sure." Morrison's tone suggested he understood exactly what kind of help was being discussed. "Just seems curious timing, her showing up right before these development fellows start sniffing around." The accusation hung in the morning air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Clara stepped forward, her movement fluid and confident despite the hostile scrutiny. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it? You run cattle on the section east of Willow Creek." Her voice carried no defensiveness, just the calm authority of someone stating obvious facts. "Lost 12 head to raiders 3 springs back. Found them by following the water sources they'd used. Reading sign most folks would have missed." Morrison's eyes widened slightly. That raid had been the talk of the county for months, and the successful recovery of stolen cattle was the kind of story that grew in the telling. But the details Clara had just mentioned were known only to Morrison and the men who'd ridden with him. "How do you know about that?" "Same way I know Mrs. Henderson's youngest has been having nightmares since his father started drinking heavy, and that the widow Patterson's been watering down the milk she sells because her best cow went dry." Clara's gaze moved steadily around the group. "People talk to midwives, tell us things they don't tell anyone else. And I used to be a midwife." The word dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Midwives occupied a special place in frontier communities, part healer, part confidant, part witness to the most intimate moments of life and death. They were trusted with secrets and sorrows that stayed buried for generations. Used to be. Sam Cartwright leaned forward, his merchant's instincts sensing a story worth hearing. "Before I took to the mountains." Clara's answer was simple but sufficient. In a land where people came to escape their pasts, questions about previous lives weren't pushed too hard. "Now I'm thinking it might be time to remember some old skills. Martha Henley won't take kindly to competition," Morrison warned. "I'm not looking to compete, looking to help." Clara straightened, her posture taking on the kind of authority that commanded respect. "Martha's been carrying the burden of this whole region's birthing for 30 years. Woman that dedicated deserves support, not competition." The shift in atmosphere was subtle, but unmistakable. Clara had just positioned herself not as an intruder or threat, but as someone offering to shoulder part of a beloved community member's load. The old men on the porch exchanged glances that spoke volumes. "Might be Martha could use the help," Cartwright admitted. "She's not as young as she used to be, and the territory keeps growing. Where exactly did you practice before?" Morrison's question carried less suspicion now, more curiosity. Clara hesitated for just a moment, her hand moving unconsciously to the silver locket at her throat. "Mountain communities mostly. Places where doctors don't venture, and women make do with whatever help they can find." It was truth carefully edited, Eli realized. Not lies, but not the complete story either. He found himself studying Clara's profile, noting the way her jaw tightened slightly when discussing her past, the careful control in her voice when she spoke of her former calling. "Well," Morrison said finally, "can't argue with the need. Lost 2 mothers this past year to childbed fever. Maybe fresh knowledge wouldn't go amiss." The endorsement was grudging but real. Clara had passed some kind of test, proved herself worthy of provisional acceptance. But Eli caught the way her fingers worried at that locket, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. They completed their business in town with relative ease after that. Supplies purchased. Casual conversations that served as intelligence gathering about Thompson and his associates. But it was the visit to Martha Henley that stayed with Eli long after they'd loaded the wagon and started home. Martha's house sat at the end of a neat street, surrounded by the kind of herb garden that spoke of professional necessity rather than mere decoration. Clara had grown increasingly quiet as they approached, Her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked almost like dread. Martha herself answered the door, a woman in her 60s with iron-grey hair and hands that spoke of decades of skilled labor. Her eyes moved from Eli to Clara and back again, recognition flickering across her weathered features. "Catherine Blackwood," she said quietly. "I wondered when you'd find your way back." "Catherine." "Not Clara." Eli filed the name away along with all the other mysteries he was accumulating about the woman who'd walked into his life. "Hello, Martha." Clara, Catherine, inclined her head slightly. "I go by Clara now." "I imagine you do." Martha's tone was neutral, but Eli caught undertones that suggested complicated history. "Heard you were helping Eli with his property. Good to see you settled somewhere. Not settled, just stopping for a while." Martha's gaze sharpened. "Well, come in then, both of you. Time we had a proper conversation." The interior of Martha's home was exactly what Eli had expected, scrupulously clean, organized with the precision of someone whose work couldn't tolerate disorder, filled with the tools and supplies of her trade. But it was the pressed flower collection displayed on one wall that made Clara stop short, her breath catching audibly. The flowers were arranged in neat rows, each one labeled with careful script-noting date and occasion. Indian paintbrush, prairie roses, wild larkspur, a catalogue of the region's seasons preserved in glass and wood. "Sarah helped me start this collection," Martha said quietly, back when she was trying to find ways to fill her days after the doctor told her she'd never carry a child to term. She had such gentle hands with delicate things. Clara moved closer to the display, her fingers hovering just above the glass that protected Sarah's careful work. She wrote about this in her journal, said it helped her remember that beauty could survive even when everything else seemed to die. Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've read Sarah's private writings?" "Eli showed them to me." The lie came easily, smoothly, but Eli caught the way Clara's shoulders tensed as she spoke it. Did he now? Martha's attention moved to Eli, speculation clear in her expression. Sarah was a private woman, didn't share her deepest thoughts with many people. The conversation had taken on undercurrents that Eli didn't entirely understand, but he sensed dangerous ground ahead. Clara, Catherine, whatever her real name was. She was walking a tightrope between truth and deception, and any misstep might bring everything crashing down. "I should start heading home," Eli said carefully. "Still got chores to finish before dark." "Of course." Martha's smile was polite but knowing. "Catherine, perhaps you'd like to stay for tea? We have some catching up to do." Clara glanced at Eli, something almost like panic flickering in her eyes before she regained control. "Thank you, but I promised to help with the evening milking. Another time, then." Martha walked them to the door, her manner pleasant but her eyes sharp with unasked questions. "Catherine, you should know. People have been asking about you. The woman who disappeared into the mountains 15 years ago. Some folks have long memories. I'm not the same person who left." "No," Martha agreed quietly. "I don't suppose you are. But the past has a way of following us, whether we want it to or not." The warning was gently delivered but unmistakable. As they drove away from Martha's house, Clara was silent for long minutes, her hands clenched in her lap. "Catherine Blackwood," Eli said finally. "Yes. Want to tell me why you changed your name?" Clara Catherine was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, because Catherine Blackwood failed someone who trusted her. "Someone who died because I wasn't skilled enough, wasn't careful enough." Her hand moved to her locket again, that unconscious gesture becoming more meaningful with each repetition. Clara's just a woman trying to make amends for Catherine's mistakes. The admission hung between them like a bridge, partially built, offering connection but not, yet strong enough to bear the full weight of truth. As they rode home through the lengthening shadows, Eli found himself wondering how many more secrets the woman beside him carried, and whether he was strong enough to bear the weight of them when they finally came to light. The discovery came 3 days later, when Clara was reorganizing the barn to make better use of the storage space. Eli was splitting wood for winter when he heard her sharp intake of breath, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to pull sound from the very air around them. He found her standing in the far corner of the barn, staring at something he'd forgotten existed. Wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind stacks of unused lumber was the cradle he'd carved during the second year of his marriage to Sarah. His hands had shaped every curve, every joint, working by lamplight through winter evenings, while Sarah sat nearby with her mending, both of them dreaming aloud about the child who would sleep in its gentle embrace, the child who never came. Clara had pulled away enough of the protective covering to reveal the headboard, carved with intertwining vines and small wildflowers, the same prairie roses and Indian paintbrush that Sarah had later pressed between the pages of books. The wood had darkened with age but remained solid, testament to careful construction and materials chosen for permanence rather than convenience. "You made this." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Long time ago, Eli set down his axe, suddenly feeling the weight of 20 years pressing against his shoulders. Sarah wanted something that would last, something our children's children might use someday. Clara's fingers traced the carved flowers with the same reverence she'd shown Sarah's journal. Her touch so gentle it seemed afraid of disturbing dreams that had already been shattered beyond repair. "It's beautiful. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Lot of hope went into that wood. Hope and foolish dreams." The bitterness in his own voice surprised Eli. He thought he'd made peace with that particular disappointment decades ago. "Not foolish." Clara turned to face him, and he was startled to see tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Never foolish to hope for life, for continuity, for love made manifest in small hands and sleepy sighs. Her breakdown was sudden and complete. 20 years of carefully controlled grief pouring out in wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her chest. Eli found himself moving toward her without conscious decision, his arms encircling her shaking form as she pressed her face against his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry. I had no right to come here, no right to disturb your peace." Catherine," she corrected fiercely. "My name is Catherine Blackwood, and I've been watching you for months. Following you to town, learning your routines, reading sign like you were some animal I was tracking." The admission came in a rush, as if confession might cleanse some deep-seated poison. "I know which days you visit Sarah's grave. Know you always bring wildflowers in season, and stand there for exactly 7 minutes before walking away." The words should have alarmed him, should have triggered every instinct for self-preservation he'd developed over decades of solitary living. Instead, Eli found himself holding her closer, one hand stroking her hair with movements that felt natural as breathing. "Why?" "Because I made a promise." Catherine pulled back enough to look at him, her face blotched with tears, but her eyes steady with painful honesty. "Not to Sarah, I never knew Sarah, but to someone who loved her. Someone who worried about what would happen to you after she was gone." Before Eli could ask who that someone was, Catherine was moving again, her restless energy driving her toward the barn's entrance despite her obvious distress. She stood silhouetted against the afternoon light, her figure rigid with the effort of maintaining control. "There's more I haven't told you," she said to the wind and grass beyond the barn door. "Things that will change how you see me, how you understand what's happening here. Then tell me." "I can't, not yet." She turned back toward him, her hand rising unconsciously to touch the silver locket at her throat. "But I need you to know that everything I've done, every lie I've told by omission, it was all meant to honor something beautiful, something that deserved better than I've given it." The cryptic words hung between them like smoke, carrying meaning just beyond his ability to grasp. Eli approached her carefully, noting the way she held herself, poised for flight despite her obvious desire to stay. "The cradle frightened you." "It reminded me." Catherine's voice was steadier now, but fragile in the way of glass that had been cracked but not yet shattered. "Reminded me of another cradle, in another place. For a child who lived 3 days before." She stopped, her throat working against words that wouldn't come. Understanding dawned like sunrise over prairie. slow and inevitable, and illuminating everything in its path. The baby you lost, the one you couldn't save, my baby. The correction was barely audible. My child, who died because his mother was stubborn and proud and thought she could handle a difficult birth without help. Catherine's hand moved to her locket, and this time she opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph so small and faded, Eli had to step closer to make out the details. An infant's face, peaceful in the way of sleep, surrounded by carefully arranged flowers. Not a portrait of life, but a memorial to it. The kind of photograph grieving parents commissioned when photographs were the only way to hold on to what had been lost. 3 days, Catherine whispered. He lived 3 days, and I held him every moment, trying to will life back into his failing body. When he finally slipped away, I thought I would die too. Wanted to die too. The silver locket closed with a soft click, sealing away the image, but not the pain that had shaped 20 years of Catherine's choices. Eli understood now why she'd run to the mountains, why she'd abandoned her calling, why she moved through the world like someone carrying an invisible wound. What was his name? Thomas, after his father. Catherine's smile was heartbreaking in its tenderness. He had the most perfect little hands, fingers like flower petals, so delicate I was afraid to touch them. They stood in silence for long moments, the weight of shared loss creating connection deeper than words. Finally, Catherine moved back to the cradle, her fingers trailing over the carved roses with new understanding. This was meant for the children you and Sarah would have. All of them. Sons and daughters we'd raise to understand this land, to value the things that last. Eli joined her beside the cradle, his own hand tracing the intricate woodwork. Sarah used to sit here sometimes in the evenings, just looking at it and talking about what our children would be like. She would have been a wonderful mother. She was a wonderful woman. Kind to everyone, patient with fools, strong enough to make a life in hard country. Eli paused, something in Catherine's expression catching his attention. You would have liked her. I know I would have. The certainty in Catherine's voice was puzzling, as if she were stating fact rather than assumption. Before he could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses interrupted. Multiple riders moving fast across the prairie toward his property. Catherine stepped immediately to the barn's entrance, her mountain-trained eyes scanning the horizon with the automatic wariness of someone accustomed to threat. Thompson, she said grimly. And more men this time? Eli moved to join her, counting 5 riders this time instead of the previous 3. They rode in formation, with the confident ease of men who expected to get their way through intimidation, or worse. They're not here to negotiate, Catherine observed. No, Eli moved toward his rifle, checking the load with practiced efficiency. They're here to escalate. Catherine watched him prepare for confrontation, her expression shifting from concern to something harder and more determined. You said you served in the war. Union Army. Cavalry mostly, Ma. Some special operations behind Confederate lines. The old skills were surfacing automatically. Assess terrain, count enemies, identify advantages and weaknesses. Good at it. Good enough to come home when a lot of men didn't. Eli levered a cartridge into his rifle's chamber. Good enough to know 5 armed men against 1 old farmer isn't favorable odds. Against 1 old farmer. Maybe. Catherine moved to the opposite side of the barn entrance, positioning herself where she could see approaching riders without being easily spotted. But I didn't spend 15 years in mountain country without learning how to handle trouble. Something in her tone made Eli look at her more carefully. The woman, who'd broken down over an unused cradle, had disappeared, replaced by someone whose stillness spoke of coiled readiness rather than passivity. What kind of trouble? The kind that takes what it wants and calls it civilization. Catherine's smile was sharp and utterly without warmth. Raiders, claim jumpers, men who think lone women are easy targets. Mountain folk taught me that sometimes the only language predators understand is violence delivered quickly and without mercy. The riders were close enough now that individual faces could be distinguished. Thompson in the lead, flanked by men whose bearing suggested professional experience with intimidation. They rode directly toward the house, ignoring the barn where Eli and Catherine waited. "They're not expecting resistance," Catherine murmured. "Look at how they're positioned. No rear guard, no one watching their flanks. They think this will be easy. It won't be." "No," Catherine agreed, her hand moving to something concealed beneath her dress. "It won't be." Thompson's voice carried clearly across the afternoon air as he dismounted in front of the house. "Murdock, come out here. Time we finished our conversation." When no immediate response came, Thompson gestured to one of his men, who moved toward the front door with obvious intent to force entry. That was when Catherine stepped into view, emerging from the barn with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned the ground she walked on. "Gentlemen," she called pleasantly, "you're trespassing." The effect was immediate and telling. 5 armed men reacted to a single woman's voice with the kind of sharp attention usually reserved for actual threats. Thompson's eyes narrowed as he studied Catherine's composed demeanor, clearly trying to reconcile her calm authority with his expectations. "Ma'am," Thompson said with exaggerated courtesy, "this is business between men. Perhaps you should go inside while we discuss matters with Mr. Murdock. Perhaps you should leave while you still can." Catherine's response carried no heat, no emotion at all, which made it infinitely more unnerving than anger would have been. Eli watched from the barn as the confrontation developed, marveling at Catherine's transformation. This wasn't the broken woman who'd wept over an unused cradle, wasn't the mysterious stranger who'd appeared with cryptic offers. This was someone who'd learned to survive in places where survival required steel wrapped in silk. Thompson clearly sensed the shift in dynamics, but pressed forward anyway, his city-bred arrogance overriding mountain-honed wisdom. "Lady, I don't know what kind of arrangement you have with Murdock, but it's about to change dramatically. This property has been marked for development, and development's going to happen whether the current occupants cooperate or not." "Marked by whom?" Catherine's question was mild, almost conversational. "By people with more resources and legal authority than one old farmer and his—" Thompson paused, his gaze moving over Catherine in a way that suggested insulting assumptions about her relationship with Eli. "Choose your next words very carefully," Catherine advised softly, "because they may be your last." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that even Thompson seemed to recognize he'd misjudged the situation. But his men were already committed to the confrontation, their hands moving toward weapons with the reflexive aggression of predators sensing weakness. That was when Eli stepped into view, his rifle held with the casual competence of someone who'd used it for more than hunting game. The tactical situation shifted immediately, 5 men facing 2 defenders who clearly weren't planning to surrender or negotiate. "You have 30 seconds to get off my land," Eli said quietly. "After that, I stop being polite." Thompson's expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and finally grudging respect. He'd expected to find an isolated old man, easy to intimidate or eliminate. Instead, he faced 2 people who looked perfectly prepared to turn this beautiful afternoon into something much uglier and more permanent. "This isn't over." "Murdock." "Yes," Catherine said with absolute finality. "It is." The words carried such conviction that Thompson actually took a step backward before catching himself. But the moment of uncertainty had been noted by his men, and Eli could see the subtle shift in group dynamics that occurred when followers began questioning their leader's judgment. The riders withdrew with as much dignity as they could manage, but the threats hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire, visible, acrid, and promising greater destruction to come. As the sound of retreating hooves faded into distance, Catherine finally allowed her rigid posture to relax. But the transformation Eli had witnessed didn't reverse entirely. The woman who'd emerged to face armed men remained visible beneath the surface, adding another layer to the mystery of who Catherine Blackwood really was. "That won't be the last we see of them," she said matter-of-factly. "No, next. Time they'll come better prepared." Eli studied her profile, noting details he'd missed before. "Where exactly did you learn to handle men like that?" Catherine's smile was enigmatic. Places where showing fear gets you killed, and showing strength keeps you alive long enough to find better options. She walked back toward the barn, pausing beside the uncovered cradle with an expression Eli couldn't quite read. Hope and sorrow mingled in her eyes, along with something that might have been determination. "This cradle," she said quietly. "It shouldn't stay hidden. Beautiful things deserve to be seen, even if they carry painful memories. It's too late for its original purpose." Maybe. Catherine's fingers traced the carved roses one final time. Or maybe its purpose is exactly what we make it. The words carried layers of meaning that resonated through Eli's understanding like ripples in still water. As evening settled over the prairie, bringing with it the promise of another night filled with questions and possibilities, he began to suspect that Catherine's arrival in his life had been planned far more carefully than either of them was ready to admit. The riders came with the morning mist, 3 figures emerging from the grey dawn like spirits summoned by Catherine's restless night. Eli woke to find her already dressed and standing at the kitchen window, her posture alert but not alarmed as she watched the approaching party. "Friends of yours?" he asked, noting the way she held herself. Ready but not defensive. Family in the truest sense. Catherine's voice carried warmth mixed with something that might have been apprehension. "People who took me in when I had nowhere else to go. Nothing left to lose." The lead rider was a woman perhaps Catherine's age, her dark hair streaked with silver and her bearing speaking of someone who belonged to this land, rather than merely traveling across it. She rode with the unconscious grace of someone born to the saddle. Her clothing, a practical blend of traditional native dress and frontier adaptation. Behind her came 2 men, one elderly with the dignified bearing of respected leadership, the other younger, but carrying himself with quiet authority that suggested significant responsibility within his community. Catherine stepped onto the porch to greet them, and Eli was surprised to hear her speak in what sounded like Lakota, her voice taking on inflections he'd never heard in their English conversations. The lead woman replied in the same language, her tone carrying both affection and gentle reproach. "This is Joseph Running Bear," Catherine said, switching to English as the elderly man dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose bones remembered too many harsh winters. "He's been like a father to me these past 15 years. Joseph studied Eli with eyes that seemed to catalogue everything worth knowing about a person in a single comprehensive glance. When he spoke, his English carried the formal cadence of someone for whom it was a learned language, carefully preserved for necessary communications. "Catherine has told us of you. She said you were a man who understood loss, who built something beautiful and then grieved when it was taken from you." His gesture encompassed the cabin, the recovering garden, the signs of life, lived with attention to meaningful detail. "I see her words carried truth. She's been a considerable help," Eli replied, uncertain of the protocols involved in this conversation, but sensing its importance. "Has she told you why she came here?" This from the younger man, whose direct stare suggested less patience with diplomatic niceties than his elder. "David," the woman warned softly. But Joseph raised a weathered hand to forestall her concern. "It is a reasonable question. Morning Star. Catherine's actions affect more people than herself alone." Catherine positioned herself between Eli and her adopted family, her stance protective without being confrontational. "I told him what he needed to know when he needed to know it. But did you tell him about the medicine bundle?" Joseph's question was delivered with matter-of-fact directness, as if spiritual experiences were simply another form of practical information. "What medicine bundle?" Catherine's hesitation was brief but telling. She reached into her belongings and withdrew a small object, wrapped in soft doeskin, something she'd been carrying but had never mentioned in their weeks. "Together, traditional healing bundle," she explained, unwrapping it to reveal an assortment of items that seemed carefully chosen rather than randomly assembled. Sage for cleansing negative spirits, sweetgrass for calling beneficial ones, red stone for courage, carved bone for strength in protecting what matters most. Morningstar stepped forward, her expression mixing concern with affection. She asked me to prepare this weeks ago, said she might need protection for herself and someone important to her. Someone important. Eli studied Catherine's face, noting the way she avoided his direct gaze. The visions told her this place would face danger, David explained, with the reluctant tone of someone sharing information he'd rather keep private. Showed her armed men, fire, the kind of trouble that destroys everything people spend lifetimes building. Joseph nodded gravely. Catherine has the spirit sight, the ability to see possibilities that haven't yet become certainties. Among our people, such gifts are considered both blessing and burden. You saw Thompson coming, Eli realized, pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in his mind. I saw several possible futures, Catherine corrected. In some, you faced the threats alone and died defending this place. In others, you had help and survived, but only because people were willing to risk everything to protect something worth saving. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air, multiple riders moving with the kind of purposeful haste that suggested urgent business rather than casual travel. Joseph's expression immediately shifted to alert wariness. "How many?" Morningstar asked, her hand moving unconsciously toward something concealed beneath her traveling coat. 7, maybe 8, Catherine said, her spiritual senses apparently providing information beyond ordinary observation. The same men from before, but more of them this time. And they're not coming to negotiate. Through the morning haze, Eli could make out the approaching party. Thompson in the lead, flanked by men whose bearing suggested professional experience with violence rather than mere intimidation. They rode with the confident formation of people who'd grown tired of subtlety and decided to settle matters through superior numbers. "They know we have witnesses now," David observed grimly. "That changes their tactical situation considerably." Joseph was already moving, his aged frame somehow projecting authority that commanded immediate attention. "David, check the approaches from the creek bed. They may try to surround us. Morningstar, position yourself where you can cover the most likely retreat routes if this goes badly." "And us?" Catherine asked, her hand moving to the concealed weapon Eli had glimpsed during their previous confrontation with Thompson. "We give them one final chance to withdraw peacefully," Joseph said with the calm certainty of someone who'd faced similar situations before. "And if they refuse, we remind them that some ground is worth dying to defend." Thompson reined in his horse at the edge of rifle range, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air, with practiced authority, designed to intimidate rather than negotiate. "Murdock, I see you've collected more company. That's unfortunate. Means more people who'll need to find somewhere else to be while we conclude our business." Joseph stepped forward, his elderly frame somehow filling more space than its physical dimensions should have allowed. "I am Joseph Running Bear of the Lakota people. This man is under our protection. You will leave now or face consequences your limited understanding cannot comprehend." Thompson's laughter was harsh with dismissive contempt. "Old man, you're a long way from your reservation, and we're not impressed by traditional threats from people living in the past." "Good," Joseph replied with perfect composure. "Fear would make you unpredictable. Contempt makes you careless, and careless enemies are easier to eliminate when elimination becomes necessary." The casual mention of killing seemed to penetrate Thompson's confidence, his eyes moving from Joseph to Morningstar to David as he reassessed the tactical situation he'd thought he understood. Catherine used his moment of uncertainty to position herself strategically, the medicine bundle clutched in one hand while the other rested on her concealed weapon. "Mr. Thompson, you're making a serious mistake. This property is legally protected, and these people are prepared to enforce that protection through whatever means prove necessary." "Legal protection?" Thompson's smile was cold and calculating. "Lady, legal protection only matters if there are witnesses left alive to testify about what happened here. The threat was explicit enough to eliminate any possibility of peaceful resolution." "What happened next?" would be determined by who was better prepared for violence and more willing to accept its consequences. Joseph began singing softly in Lakota, his voice carrying words that seemed to call something from the wind and grass around them. Morning Star and David joined the song, their voices weaving together in harmony that spoke of spiritual preparation for physical confrontation. The medicine bundle in Catherine's hand grew warm, and Eli found himself remembering skills he'd thought were buried with his youth. How to assess terrain for tactical advantages, how to read enemy formations for weaknesses, how to prepare mentally for the moment when survival depended on willingness to kill rather than mere courage to fight. Last warning. "Murdock," Thompson called, his men spreading out to establish the kind of crossfire positions that would make resistance seem hopeless. "Sign the papers, take the money, and everyone walks away from this alive." Catherine stepped closer to Eli, her presence solid and reassuring despite the overwhelming odds they faced. "The medicine bundle carries the prayers of people who've survived worse than this," she said quietly. "Hold on to it and remember what we're defending." "What are we defending exactly?" Catherine's smile was fierce and beautiful and utterly without compromise. "The right to choose our own futures instead of having them chosen for us by men who mistake greed for vision." As Thompson's men completed their encirclement, Eli felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, 20 years of grief and guilt crystallizing into purpose that went beyond mere survival. He'd spent 2 decades mourning what had been lost, but Catherine and her adopted family had reminded him that some things were worth fighting to protect. Even when victory seemed impossible, the medicine bundle pulsed with warmth in his hand, and somewhere in the gathering tension, he thought he heard Sarah's voice, whispering encouragement from whatever realm held the spirits of those who'd loved completely and lost everything. "Well, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice carrying across the morning air with perfect clarity, "I believe you have your answer." Thompson's face darkened with frustrated anger, but also with something that might have been respect for people who refused to be intimidated by superior numbers or threats of violence. "So be it," Thompson said finally. "You've chosen how this ends." "Yes," Eli agreed, feeling the weight of choice settle into certainty. "We have." The respite came at midday, when Thompson and his men withdrew to what they clearly considered a safe distance to plan their assault. They'd established themselves on a rise about a mile east of Eli's property, close enough to maintain surveillance, but far enough to avoid rifle fire. Through Joseph's field glasses, military issue, Eli noted with interest they could observe the enemy making camp with all the casualness of men who believed victory was merely a matter of timing. "They'll wait for dark," Morning Star observed, accepting the glasses from her adoptive father. "Use fire to flush us out, then shoot anyone who runs." "Crude but effective," David agreed grimly, "unless we can even the odds somehow." Catherine had been unusually quiet since Thompson's departure, her attention divided between watching the enemy and studying something she'd retrieved from her personal belongings. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd reached a difficult decision. "There's something I need to tell you. All of you." She held up a yellowed piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn white. "A telegram I've been carrying for 20 years. Eli accepted the fragile document with careful hands, noting the way Catherine's fingers trembled as she released it. The paper was dated June 15th, 1853, just 2 years after Sarah's death, and addressed to someone named Catherine Blackwood at a location in Colorado Territory. The key message was brief but devastating. "Regret to inform Sister Sarah Murdock, deceased. Stop consumption. Stop husband Eli requests no contact. Stop burial private. Stop condolences. Stop." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. Sister. Catherine wasn't just someone who'd learned about Sarah from casual observation or even careful research. She was Sarah's sister, family that Sarah had never mentioned in 20 years of marriage. "You're her sister." The words came out flat, emotionless as his mind struggled to process this fundamental revision of everything he thought he knew. Half-sister, Catherine corrected quietly. Same mother, different fathers? I was given away when I was 3 after Mama died. Adopted by a family heading west. Never saw Sarah again after that. Joseph and his companions exchanged glances that spoke of long-held knowledge. They'd known Catherine's true identity all along, had been part of whatever plan brought her to Eli's door with offers that echoed Sarah's private writings. How did you find her? Eli's voice was hoarse with emotions he couldn't quite name. Took me 15 years of searching, following rumors, checking church records, asking questions in every town between Denver and St. Louis. Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. By the time I traced her to this place, she'd been dead 2 years. The postmaster in town told me you'd specifically requested that no one contact you about her death. Said you wanted to grieve alone. So I did. The memory of those first terrible years after Sarah's death rose like bile in his throat. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers offering sympathy, of having to explain our life together to people who'd never known her. I wasn't a stranger. I was her sister. The pain in Catherine's voice was raw and immediate. I'd been searching for her my entire adult life, dreaming of the reunion we'd have, the way we'd fill in all the empty years between childhood and... She stopped, unable to continue. Morningstar moved to Catherine's side, offering the kind of wordless comfort that suggested long familiarity with this particular grief. She came to us broken, she said quietly. Not just from losing her own child, but from learning she'd lost her sister too, arrived too late to say goodbye or make amends. What amends? Eli found his voice again, though it sounded strange in his own ears. Sarah never mentioned having a sister because she thought I was dead. Catherine pulled another document from her belongings, a letter written in Sarah's careful hand. I found this among her things when I finally got up the courage to ask the county clerk about her property. She'd written to every adoption agency, every church, every territorial office she could think of, trying to find me. Eli took the letter with hands that shook despite his efforts at control. Sarah's handwriting was achingly familiar. Each word formed with the meticulous care she'd brought to everything she considered important. My dearest Catherine, the letter began, I pray this finds you well and happy wherever life has taken you. Not a day passes that I don't wonder what became of the little girl who used to braid flowers in my hair and insist we were going to live in the same house forever. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Sarah's life with Eli, their struggles with childlessness, her fear that she'd never have family beyond her husband's devoted love. It ended with a promise that if Catherine ever received the letter, she would always have a home with Sarah and Eli, no matter what circumstances had shaped the years between their separation and reunion. She mailed this to 17 different locations, Catherine said softly. Churches, territorial offices, adoption agencies. None of them ever reached me, because by then I was living with Joseph's people, using a different name, trying to forget I'd ever been Catherine Blackwood. The weight of missed connections and lost time settled over the group like morning fog. Eli found himself studying Catherine's face with new understanding, seeing echoes of Sarah in the shape of her eyes, the set of her shoulders when she was determined about something. The journal, he said suddenly. You didn't just read Sarah's private thoughts. You recognized them because they were about you, about the sister she'd lost and hoped to find again, about the family she wished she could give you, Catherine corrected. Sarah wrote about me, yes, but always in the context of what my presence might mean for your happiness. She worried you blamed yourself for her inability to have children, worried you'd spend the rest of your life alone and bitter. Joseph cleared his throat gently, drawing attention to the practical realities they faced. This is all very touching, but Thompson and his men won't be moved by family reunions. They'll still come at dark, and we still need a plan to survive the night. David nodded toward the distant rise where their enemies had made camp. 7 men, all armed, probably experienced with this kind of work. We've got 4 fighters, maybe 5, if Eli's military experience counts for something. It counts, Eli said quietly, his mind already shifting from personal revelations to tactical considerations. Question is whether Catherine's visions show us surviving this, or just dying together instead of separately. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on something beyond the visible horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the dreamy quality that suggested she was seeing more than the present moment. The path splits tonight. In one version, we try to hold them off defensively, and the house burns with all of us inside. She shuddered, her spiritual sight apparently showing details she'd rather not see. In the other, we take the fight to them before they expect it, and she stopped, her expression growing troubled. And what? And someone doesn't survive to see morning. Someone important. Someone whose loss will change everything that comes after. Catherine's gaze moved around the group, touching each face as if trying to determine which of them the spirits had marked for sacrifice. Morning Star began unpacking supplies from her saddlebags. Ammunition, dried food, items that suggested they'd come prepared for a siege. In my experience, the spirits show possibilities, not certainties. What matters is how we choose to meet what's coming. Agreed, Joseph said. The question becomes whether we wait for them to attack on their terms, or create terms of our own. Eli found himself thinking about the medicine bundle Catherine had given him, still warm in his pocket despite the afternoon's cooling air. The carved wolf bone seemed particularly significant now, strength in defending what matters. But what exactly were they? The attack came 2 hours before dawn, but not from the direction anyone had expected. Eli woke to the sound of Catherine's sharp intake of breath, followed by her urgent whisper, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. They're not coming from the east. They split up, half circling around to approach from the creek bed. The rest staying put to make us think they're all still in camp. Eli rolled from his bedroll, automatically reaching for the rifle that had become his constant companion. Around their makeshift camp in the old line cabin, Joseph and his companions stirred with the silent efficiency of people accustomed to waking to danger. How many? Morning Star whispered, already moving toward the narrow window that faced the creek. 8, maybe 10 in the first group. Hard to count in the darkness, but they're moving like they know exactly where they're going. Catherine's voice carried the strained quality that suggested her spiritual senses were working overtime. This isn't random. Someone told them about this cabin, about the defensive positions we'd likely choose. The implications hit Eli like cold water. Someone from town, or someone who's been watching us longer than we realized. Joseph's weathered face was grim in the starlight filtering through the cabin's single window. The question now is whether we can turn their knowledge against them. David had positioned himself at the back wall of the cabin, listening intently to sounds that might indicate enemies approaching from multiple directions. Movement to the south as well. Sounds like horses, but trying to stay quiet about it. A 3-pronged attack, Eli muttered, his military experience automatically analyzing the tactical situation. Pin us in the cabin while the main force approaches from the most advantageous angle. Catherine closed her eyes, her face taking on the distant expression that meant she was consulting her visions. The spirits are agitated tonight. Too many possibilities, too many variables. But I keep seeing the same image. Papers burning and someone screaming about lies and stolen names. Before anyone could ask what that meant, the first shots rang out from the direction of the creek. Not aimed fire, but the kind of rapid shooting meant to create panic and confusion. Return fire came immediately from the cabin's east window, Joseph's rifle speaking with the measured authority of someone who didn't waste ammunition on empty gestures. They're trying to drive us out. Morning Star observed, her own weapon trained on the shadows that might conceal advancing enemies. Force us to run toward the main group waiting in better positions, or force us to stay put while they burn us out. Eli could smell smoke now, though whether it was coming from their location or somewhere else was hard to determine in the chaos of gunfire and shouting. Catherine suddenly went rigid, her eyes flying open with an expression of shock that bordered on terror. "They're not just burning the cabin. They're burning everything. Your house, the barn, the garden. Everything Sarah built." The words hit Eli with physical force. All the careful improvements, all the evidence of a life lived with love and attention to detail, being destroyed by men who saw only obstacles to be removed rather than dreams made manifest in wood and stone. "I have to—" He started toward the door, but Joseph's firm hand on his shoulder stopped him. "You have to survive. Buildings can be rebuilt. Lives cannot be restored once they're lost to foolish heroism." More gunfire erupted from the south, confirming that they were indeed surrounded. But something about the pattern of shots seemed wrong to Eli's experienced ear, too scattered, too poorly coordinated for professional fighters. "They're not all experienced," he realized aloud. "Some of these are just local men looking for easy money. They'll break if the fighting gets serious." "Good," Catherine said grimly, pulling something from her belongings that made everyone in the cabin stare. It was a Colt Navy revolver, well-maintained, and carried with the familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. "Because I'm tired of being hunted." The transformation in Catherine was immediate and complete. The woman who'd wept over unused cradles and spoke gently of spiritual visions disappeared, replaced by someone whose every movement spoke of deadly competence. She moved to the cabin's front wall, positioning herself where she could cover the most likely approach routes. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" David asked, noting the professional way she checked her weapon's load and sighted potential targets. "Mountain country teaches hard lessons to women traveling alone. The ones who don't learn fast enough don't survive long enough to learn at all." Catherine's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if discussing weather rather than violence. A new sound cut through the gunfire, shouting from the direction of Thompson's original camp, but not the coordinated commands of an attacking force. This sounded like confusion, possibly panic. Joseph risked a look through the east window, using his field glasses to peer through the darkness toward the distant rise. "Something's happening at their camp. Looks like—" He stopped, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching satisfaction. "What?" "Riders! Coming from the north, moving fast. Can't make out details, but there are a lot of them." Catherine's face lit up with sudden understanding. "The dreams. The other people I saw, the ones who weren't part of Thompson's group or ours. They're here." Before anyone could ask who they might be, a new voice cut through the night, amplified by a speaking trumpet and carrying the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "This is Sheriff Davies of the Territorial Marshal Service, accompanied by federal deputies. You men are ordered to lay down your weapons and surrender immediately. This property is under federal protection pending resolution of legal disputes." The effect on the attacking forces was immediate and dramatic. The scattered gunfire from amateur fighters stopped entirely, replaced by the sounds of men retreating as quickly as stealth allowed. But the shots from more experienced positions continued, suggesting that some of Thompson's hired professionals were prepared to fight law enforcement if necessary. "Federal marshals," Morningstar breathed. Someone with serious authority decided this situation needed serious intervention. Catherine was already moving toward the door, her spiritual senses apparently providing information the rest of them lacked. Martha. She didn't just send warnings, she sent for help. Used the telegraph to contact territorial authorities about armed men threatening lawful property owners. "Smart woman," Eli observed, feeling hope stir in his chest for the first time since the siege began. But his relief was premature. Even as the less committed attackers melted away into the darkness, the professional fighters Thompson had hired were regrouping for a more desperate kind of assault. Men faced with federal charges for attempted murder might decide their only option was to eliminate all witnesses and flee the territory. "They're not giving up," Joseph warned, his eyes tracking movement in the pre-dawn gloom. "The smart ones are running, but the desperate ones are getting ready for a final push." Catherine nodded grimly. The visions showed this. The moment when everything balanced on a knife's edge. when the difference between salvation and destruction came down to who was willing to risk everything for what they believed in. She moved toward the cabin door, her intention clear despite the obvious danger. Eli caught her arm as she passed, stopping her with gentle but firm pressure. "Where are you going?" "To end this." Catherine's eyes held a determination that went beyond mere courage into something approaching transcendence. "The papers Thompson wants, the legal documents that prove ownership, they're not here. They're back at your house, in the strongbox Sarah kept for important documents. Let them burn with everything else." "No." Catherine's voice carried absolute finality. "Those papers are the only thing standing between Thompson's scheme and success. If they're destroyed, he wins by default. The law can't protect property rights that can't be proven." Before Eli could argue, Catherine was moving again, slipping through the cabin door with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to move unseen through dangerous territory. Morningstar started to follow, but Joseph caught her arm. "Let her go. This is her fight as much as anyone's, and she knows things we don't." Through the window, they watched Catherine disappear into the darkness, moving toward the flames that marked the destruction of everything Eli and Sarah had built together. The irony was perfect and terrible. Sarah's sister risking her life to save legal documents that would preserve Sarah's final gift to the husband she'd never stopped loving. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by shouted commands and the kind of organized movement that suggested professional law enforcement. But would they arrive in time to prevent Catherine from walking into a trap that might cost her everything she'd fought so hard to reclaim? In his pocket, the medicine bundle seemed to pulse with warmth, and Eli found himself whispering prayers to whatever spirits watched over foolish women who risked their lives for the sake of justice and memory. The dawn was coming, bringing with it either salvation or tragedy, and there was nothing left to do but wait and see which version of the future Catherine's visions would prove accurate. The flames had reached the main house by the time Eli made his decision. Through the cabin window, he could see the orange glow spreading across his property like a malignant sunrise, consuming 20 years of careful construction and cherished memory. But it wasn't the destruction of buildings that drove him to action. It was the sight of Catherine moving through the smoke and chaos like a ghost seeking redemption. "I can't let her go alone," he said quietly, checking his rifle one final time. "The marshals are almost here," Joseph warned. "Federal law enforcement will handle Thompson's men. You don't need to risk. This isn't about Thompson." Eli moved toward the door, his mind clear despite the chaos surrounding them. "This is about making sure Sarah's sister doesn't die, trying to save something I should have protected myself." Morningstar understood first, her nod carrying the weight of someone who recognized duty when she saw it. "Some debts can only be paid by the people who owe them. Some fights can only be finished by the people who started them," David added, his respect evident despite his concern. Joseph studied Eli's face in the flickering firelight, reading something there that satisfied whatever test the old warrior was applying. Slowly, he reached into his pack and withdrew an object wrapped in soft buckskin, something he'd carried for decades but never spoken of in Eli's presence. "If you're going out there, you should know who you really are." Joseph unwrapped the object with ceremonial care, revealing a military medal that caught the light with burnished authority. Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded to Sergeant Major Eli Murdock for extraordinary heroism during the Battle of Cedar Creek. Eli stared at the medal he'd hidden away 20 years ago, after Sarah died, and military honors seemed like hollow consolation for a life that had lost all its meaning. "How did you—" "Catherine asked me to research your military service when she first told us about you. She needed to know if you were the kind of man worth saving, worth bringing her sister's final gift to." Joseph's eyes held understanding deeper than mere knowledge. What she found was a soldier who'd earned every military honor his country could bestow, then walked away from all of it to build something beautiful with a woman he loved more than glory. The weight of the medal seemed to transfer itself to Eli's chest, reminding him of responsibilities he'd thought were buried with his youth and idealism, leadership, courage, the Willingness to risk everything to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The Battle of Cedar Creek. Morningstar said quietly, "I've heard the stories. One man holding a bridge against an entire Confederate company while his unit evacuated civilians." 13 minutes, Eli said softly, the memory rising unbidden from whatever place he'd tried to bury it. "I held that position for 13 minutes against impossible odds and somehow lived to tell about it. And tonight," Joseph asked gently. Eli looked out at the flames consuming his property, at the shadows that might conceal enemies or allies, at the woman who'd walked into his life carrying secrets and sorrows that matched his own. "Tonight I find out if 20 years of peace made me too soft to remember what I used to be." He moved toward the door, but Joseph's voice stopped him at the threshold. "Eli, the visions Catherine shared with us, they showed two possible endings. In one, you both die heroes and change nothing. In the other. Joseph's smile was enigmatic and strangely hopeful. "In the other, you both live to see what can be built from the ashes of what was destroyed." The words followed Eli into the darkness as he slipped from the cabin and began making his way toward the burning house. The pre-dawn air was thick with smoke and the sounds of distant shouting, some organized, some panicked, all of it speaking to a situation balanced on the edge of either resolution or catastrophe. Federal marshals had indeed arrived, their voices carrying the authority of law backed by superior numbers and legal mandate. But Thompson's remaining men were professional enough to know that surrender meant federal prosecution for attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Men facing those kinds of charges might decide their only option was to eliminate witnesses and disappear into the vast anonymity of the Western territories. Catherine was nowhere to be seen in the immediate vicinity of the house, but Eli could read sign that spoke of her passage. Disturbed earth, broken vegetation, the kind of subtle traces left by someone moving with purpose through familiar terrain. She was heading not for the main house, but for the root cellar, where Sarah had kept their most important documents. Smart thinking. The underground storage would provide protection from both fire and bullets, but it was also the kind of obvious target that enemies might anticipate and prepare for. Catherine was walking into what could easily become a trap. And she knew it. The medicine bundle in Eli's pocket seemed to grow warmer as he moved closer to the flames, and he found himself drawing on reserves of courage and tactical thinking he'd thought were lost to age and domesticity. The skills were still there, embedded in muscle memory and instinct: how to read terrain for advantages, how to move unseen through hostile territory, how to assess enemies and plan approaches that turned their strengths into weaknesses. The root cellar was built into the hillside behind the main house, its entrance concealed by careful landscaping that Sarah had designed to look natural while providing practical camouflage. Even knowing where to look, it took Eli several minutes to spot the signs of recent disturbance that indicated someone had used the entrance recently. But as he approached, the sound of voices made him freeze in place. Two men, positioned where they could watch both the cellar entrance and the approaches to it, talking in low tones that carried just far enough for him to catch fragments, should have grabbed the woman when she went in. Thompson said, "Wait until she finds the papers, then take them both. Marshals get too close. We kill them and run." The conversation confirmed his worst fears. Thompson's men had anticipated Catherine's move and were using her as bait to draw him into a killing ground of their choosing. Professional thinking applied to an amateur's desperation, the kind of trap that worked, because it played on predictable human behavior. But Eli Murdock hadn't survived the Civil War by being predictable, moving with patience learned in a dozen similar situations. He began a wide circle that would bring him to the cellar from an unexpected direction. The approach would take longer, would risk letting Catherine fall deeper into whatever trap waited for her, but it offered the only realistic chance of turning the tactical situation to their advantage. As he moved through the familiar landscape, now made strange by fire and shadow, Eli found himself remembering other nights when everything had balanced on the edge of violence and victory. Cedar Creek, where 13 minutes had felt like 13 hours. Antietam, where he'd carried wounded comrades through a battlefield that looked like hell's preview. Gettysburg, where he'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Tonight felt like all of those battles compressed into a single moment of choice. Sarah's sister was risking her life to preserve the legal proof of Sarah's final gift to him. Federal marshals were risking their careers to protect civilians from armed criminals. Joseph and his adopted family were risking everything to stand by people who'd become important to them, and Eli Murdock was about to find out if a 60-year-old farmer could remember how to be the soldier who'd once held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. The Congressional Medal of Honor felt heavier than its actual weight as he moved through the darkness. But it wasn't burden, it was reminder. Some things were worth fighting for, some people were worth dying to protect. Some moments required a man to become more than he thought himself capable of being. The root cellar came into view through the smoke and shadows, its entrance darker than the surrounding darkness. Somewhere inside, Catherine was searching for documents that would determine the future of everything Sarah had hoped to leave behind. Somewhere outside, men with guns were waiting for the moment when they could end this situation with the kind of finality that left no witnesses and no evidence, but they hadn't counted on facing someone who'd learned warfare from the best teachers possible, necessity and survival, love and loss, the kind of education that created soldiers worth remembering. Eli Murdock checked his rifle one final time and began moving toward a confrontation that would determine whether Sarah's legacy lived on in her sister's capable hands or died in the flames, consuming the dreams of a lifetime. As the way, he was done hiding from fights that mattered. The moment came when Eli saw Catherine emerge from the root cellar, a leather document case clutched against her chest like armor. She moved with the careful precision of someone who knew danger waited in the shadows. But her attention was focused on the papers she'd risked everything to retrieve, rather than the two armed men positioned to intercept her. It was then that Eli made the conscious decision that would define the rest of his life or end it in the next few minutes. His hand moved to Sarah's wedding ring, still worn on his finger after 20 years of widowhood, and for the first time since her death, he slowly worked it free. The simple gold band caught the firelight as he placed it carefully in his shirt pocket, next to the medicine bundle that had guided him through this long night. The gesture was simultaneously practical and symbolic. He couldn't afford to have his shooting hand encumbered by sentiment. But more than that, removing the ring felt like permission to step fully into the present moment instead of living in the shadows of the past. "Sarah," he whispered to the smoke-filled darkness, "I hope you understand what I'm about to do." The first shot came from Thompson's men as Catherine stepped into the open ground between the cellar and the house. Not aimed to kill, they needed her alive long enough to secure the documents, but close enough to freeze her in place while they closed the distance. Catherine's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of dropping to the ground in panic as they'd expected, she shifted the document case to her offhand and drew her concealed revolver with movements that spoke of professional training and hard-earned experience. "Federal marshals," she shouted, her voice carrying across the flame-lit chaos with practiced authority. "Stand down immediately or face federal charges." The bluff was brilliant in its audacity, but doomed by circumstances. Thompson's men had heard the real marshals approaching from the other direction, knew that Catherine was alone and potentially trapped between multiple threats. That was when Eli stepped into view, his rifle trained on the nearest gunman with the kind of steady precision that suggested absolute confidence in the shot he was about to take. "Gentlemen," he said conversationally, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd faced similar situations many times before. "You're outgunned, outmaneuvered, and about to be very dead if you don't drop your weapons immediately." The effect was electric. Two professional fighters who'd been confident in their tactical advantage suddenly found themselves caught between a woman who moved, like she knew how to use the gun in her hand, and a man whose bearing suggested military experience they hadn't accounted for. "There's only one of you." "Old man," the lead gunman snarled, but his voice carried uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. "One of me," Eli agreed pleasantly. "But I only need one shot per target, and I've got more ammunition than you have lives to spend." The standoff stretched taut as wire, balanced on the edge of violence that would determine whether the night ended in salvation or tragedy. Catherine used the momentary hesitation to move toward better cover, her eyes meeting Eli's across the smoke-filled space, with understanding that went beyond words. "The documents," she called softly. "They're all here. Sarah's will, the property deed, my birth certificate. Everything Thompson needs, destroyed to make his scheme work." "Then we better make sure they survive the night," Eli replied, his rifle never wavering from its target. The tension broke when the second gunman made the mistake of assuming an aging farmer wouldn't have the nerve to shoot first. His hand moved toward his sidearm with practiced speed, but not fast enough to account for reflexes honed by years of military service and 20 years of hunting game that moved faster than human enemies. Eli's rifle spoke once, precisely, and the man went down with the finality of someone who'd made a fatal miscalculation about the person he was facing. The surviving gunman's face went white with shock and sudden understanding. He was no longer dealing with civilians he could intimidate, but with people who were perfectly prepared to kill in defense of what they valued. "Jesus," he breathed, his weapon still holstered, but his hands raised slightly in unconscious surrender. "You actually did it." "I actually did," Eli confirmed, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "And I'll do it again if necessary." "The question you need to ask yourself is whether Thompson's money is worth dying for." Before the man could answer, the sound of approaching horses cut through the night, federal marshals arriving with the kind of organized authority that suggested the siege was finally over. But their arrival presented its own complications, since Eli was now standing over a dead man with a smoking rifle in his hands. Catherine moved quickly to position herself where she could address the approaching law enforcement. The document case still clutched protectively against her chest. "Federal Marshals, this is Catherine Blackwood, legal owner of this property. We have armed men attempting to steal legal documents and commit arson." The response came in the form of a dozen mounted men emerging from the smoke, their badges and bearing confirming their authority. At their head rode a man whose weathered face and careful eyes suggested extensive experience with frontier violence. "I'm Marshal Davidson, Territorial Authority. Someone want to explain why there's a dead man on the ground and why half the county's on fire?" Eli set his rifle aside but remained ready to retrieve it if the situation took an unexpected turn. "Sir, my name is Eli Murdock. This is my property, and these people have been trying to burn us out and steal legal documents proving ownership of adjacent land." "Documents we have right here," Catherine added, opening the leather case to reveal papers that had somehow survived both fire and gunfight. "Property deeds, wills, birth certificates, everything proving my legal claim to lands these men wanted to develop illegally." Marshal Davidson examined the documents by lantern light, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read. "And Thompson? Where's the man behind all this?" "Still out there somewhere," Catherine replied, gesturing toward the darkness beyond the flames. "He had close to 20 men when this started, but most of them scattered when they heard federal authority was coming. Smart ones ran," Eli added. "The desperate ones stayed to fight. And desperation makes people dangerous in ways money never does." As if summoned by his words, Thompson's voice cut through the night from somewhere beyond the circle of Marshal-controlled territory. He was using a speaking trumpet, his message carried clearly across the smoke and chaos. "Marshal Davidson. I'm Edwin Thompson, representing legitimate business interests with legal claims to this property. These people are armed squatters who've been threatening lawful development." Davidson's expression suggested he'd heard similar claims before and had developed a healthy skepticism about men who needed to shout their legitimacy from hidden positions. "Mr. Thompson, if your claims are legitimate, you can present them in federal court rather than through armed assault on civilian property." "These aren't civilians." Thompson's voice carried the edge of desperation that suggested he understood how badly his situation had deteriorated. "The woman is Catherine Blackwood, wanted for murder in Colorado Territory. The man is a military deserter with outstanding warrants." The accusations hung in the smoky air like poison, designed to create enough doubt to give Thompson room for escape or negotiation. But Catherine stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who'd expected this particular attack. "Marshal, I have documentation of my complete military and civilian record, including discharge papers from volunteer service as a field medic during the Indian campaigns." She produced another set of papers from the document case. As for the murder charges Thompson mentioned, they were dropped when witnesses testified that I acted in self-defense against men who attacked a camp. Davidson reviewed the new documents with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that frontier. Justice often involved distinguishing between legal technicalities and actual guilt. "These appear authentic. What about you, Mr. Murdock?" Eli reached into his pocket and withdrew the Congressional Medal of Honor, its weight somehow lighter now that he'd accepted its implications for who he'd been and who he needed to become again. "Sergeant Major Elijah Murdock, 1st Cavalry, Union Army. Honorable discharge, full pension, no outstanding warrants of any kind." The words came out with military precision. Formal recognition of service he'd tried to forget but could no longer deny. Davidson's eyes widened as he recognized the significance of the medal. "Cedar Creek." "Among other places." Eli's voice carried the understated modesty of someone who'd earned the right to let his actions speak rather than his words. "Well, I'll be damned." Davidson's respect was evident and immediate. "I served under Colonel Hayes at Cedar Creek, heard the stories about the sergeant who held the bridge while civilians evacuated. Never thought I'd meet the man himself." The recognition changed the dynamic entirely. Thompson's accusations had been designed to create legal confusion, but they'd instead revealed that the people he was attacking had credentials that commanded automatic respect from federal authority. "Thompson," Davidson called toward the darkness, "your accusations have been reviewed and found to be false. You have federal marshals prepared to arrest you and your associates on charges of arson, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Surrender now, and you might live to see trial." The response came not in words but in gunfire, desperate shots from multiple directions as Thompson's remaining men made their final play for escape or victory. But professional law enforcement with superior numbers and legal authority was a different opponent than isolated civilians. And the one-sided battle was over almost before it began. Catherine grabbed Eli's arm as bullets whined overhead, pulling him toward the cover of the root cellar entrance, where thick earthwork provided protection from ricochets and wild shots. "The ring," she said suddenly, her eyes focusing on his bare finger with surprise that bordered on shock. "You took off Sarah's ring." "Seemed like the right time," Eli replied, checking his rifle, even though the marshals seemed to have the situation well under control. "Hard to fight for the future while holding on to the past with both hands." Catherine's expression shifted through several emotions too complex to name, settling finally on something that looked like understanding mixed with hope. "What happens now?" "Now we find out if we're the kind of people who can build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed." Eli gestured toward the smoldering remains of the house he'd shared with Sarah. Then at the documents that proved Catherine's legal claim to the land Sarah had wanted to give him. "Your sister left us a gift, but it's up to us to decide what to do with it." The gunfire had stopped, replaced by the sound of men surrendering and being taken into custody. Marshal Davidson appeared at the cellar entrance, his face grim but satisfied. Thompson's in custody, along with 4 of his men. The rest either scattered or didn't survive the night. He paused, studying the ruins of the house and the two people who'd risked everything to defend it. Question is, what are your plans now? This property's going to take considerable work to rebuild. Catherine and Eli exchanged glances that spoke of conversations they'd never had, but somehow didn't need to have. The night had burned away more than buildings. It had burned away pretenses, defenses, and the careful distance they'd maintained while learning to trust each other. "We'll rebuild," Catherine said quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd finally found a place worth fighting for. "But we'll rebuild it better, bigger, strong enough to last for generations." "We?" Eli asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "We," Catherine confirmed, her hand moving unconsciously to the silver locket that held her son's photograph. "Sarah left me this land so I could give you the family she couldn't provide. Maybe it's time we both stopped fighting our ghosts and started building something they'd be proud of." Marshal Davidson nodded approvingly. "Sounds like a plan worth supporting. I'll make sure the territorial government knows about your legal claims. Make sure nobody else tries to challenge your ownership through questionable means." As the marshal walked away to supervise the arrest of Thompson's remaining associates, Eli found himself studying Catherine's profile in the flickering light of the dying fires. The woman who'd appeared at his door with mysterious offers and hidden knowledge had revealed herself to be someone far more complex and valuable than he'd dared to hope. "The cradle," he said suddenly, remembering the carved piece hidden in the barn. "If the barn survived, we should move it to the house. When we rebuild, it should have a place of honor." Catherine's smile was radiant and transformative, carrying hope that seemed to light the darkness around them. "Yes, and maybe this time it won't stay empty as long." The words hung between them like a promise, carrying implications that would need time and careful attention to fully develop. But as dawn began to touch the eastern horizon with colors that spoke of new beginnings rather than endings, Eli Murdock allowed himself to believe that some losses could be transformed into unexpected gains, and that some endings were actually beginnings in disguise. The medicine bundle in his pocket had grown cool, its work apparently finished. Sarah's ring waited in his shirt pocket, a reminder of love that had been rather than a chain, binding him to the past. And somewhere in the growing light of a new day, the future stretched ahead with possibilities he was finally ready to embrace. The final confrontation came at dawn, when Thompson made his desperate bid for freedom. He'd been secured in the marshal's temporary custody, but desperation and the promise of enormous profits had driven him to one last gamble that would determine whether justice or greed claimed the final victory. "The documents are forgeries," he announced loudly as Marshal Davidson prepared to transport prisoners back to the territorial capital. "I can prove that woman has no legal claim to any property in this territory." Catherine stiffened beside Eli, her hand moving protectively to the document case that had survived fire and gunfight. "Marshal, everything I've shown you is authentic. Birth certificates, property deeds, Sarah's will, all properly witnessed and recorded." "Are they?" Thompson's smile was sharp with the confidence of someone playing his final best card. "Marshal, check the dates on those documents. Check them carefully against territorial records of when Catherine Blackwood supposedly died in Colorado." Davidson frowned, extracting Catherine's papers from his evidence pouch and studying them with renewed attention. His expression grew troubled as he compared dates and cross-referenced information that should have aligned perfectly. "There's a problem," he said quietly. "According to Colorado territorial records, Catherine Blackwood died in a mining camp incident 3 years ago. If that's true, these documents were created by someone impersonating a dead woman." The accusation hit Catherine like a physical blow, but her response carried the fierce authority of someone who'd anticipated this exact challenge. She reached into her belongings and withdrew something Eli hadn't seen before, a leather-bound book that bore the unmistakable appearance of a family Bible. "This belonged to my mother," she said, opening the book to pages that recorded births, deaths, and marriages in careful script. Sarah's mother, before she remarried and gave me away to the family heading west. The Bible was old, its pages yellowed with age and handling, but the entries were clearly authentic, written in different hands over decades of family history. Davidson studied the records with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to distinguish genuine documents from clever forgeries. According to this, you were born Catherine Sarah Hensley, daughter of Margaret Hensley and William Blackwood. But Sarah was born Sarah Margaret Hensley, daughter of Margaret Hensley and James Morrison. Same mother, different fathers, Catherine confirmed. Mother remarried after my father was killed in a hunting accident. Sarah was born 2 years later. Thompson's confident expression began to waver as the implications became clear. That still doesn't prove... It proves everything, Catherine interrupted, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd prepared for this moment for 20 years. Look at the death records, Marshal. The Catherine Blackwood who died in Colorado was Catherine Mary Blackwood, daughter of Irish immigrants. Different woman entirely, similar name. Davidson's frown deepened as he studied the Bible's records alongside the territorial documents Thompson had referenced. The dates and parentage don't match. Different families, different histories, but similar enough names to create confusion, Catherine added, which is exactly what Thompson was counting on. Legal complications that would tie up property claims in court long enough for him to complete his development scheme. Eli watched this bureaucratic duel with the fascination of someone seeing legal warfare conducted at the highest level. Catherine had anticipated every challenge Thompson might raise and prepared documentation that would withstand scrutiny from territorial courts. There's more, she continued, turning to pages near the back of the Bible where additional documents had been carefully preserved. Letters from Sarah, searching for me after Mother died. Letters I never received because I was living under an adopted name with Joseph's people. The letters were brief but heartbreaking. Sarah's desperate attempts to reconnect with the sister she'd lost to circumstance and geography. Each one spoke of love that had survived separation, hope that had endured disappointment, and faith that family bonds could overcome any obstacle time and distance might create. Davidson read several of the letters, his expression softening as he recognized the genuine emotion behind Sarah's careful words. These appear authentic. Personal details, specific memories, the kind of information that couldn't be faked by someone who didn't know the family history. Because they're real, Catherine said simply. Every word Sarah wrote, every hope she held for our reunion, every plan she made to bring me home, all of it genuine. Thompson's face had gone pale as he realized his final legal challenge was crumbling under the weight of documentation he'd never suspected existed. Those could still be forgeries, Mr. Thompson, Marshal Davidson interrupted, with the tone of someone whose patience had reached its limits. You're facing federal charges for arson, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I suggest you save your creative legal theories for your defense attorney. But Catherine wasn't finished. She turned to another section of the Bible, one that contained marriage records and property. Transfers that painted a complete picture of the family's financial history. Sarah inherited the Western property from our mother's estate, she explained, her finger tracing entries that documented the legal transfer. Mother had purchased the land as an investment, intending to leave equal shares to both daughters. When I disappeared and was presumed dead, Sarah inherited everything with instructions to find me if possible and share the inheritance. Which she tried to do, Eli said softly, remembering his wife's persistent efforts to locate information about her missing sister, which she tried to do for 20 years, Catherine confirmed. Every letter she wrote, every inquiry she made, every dollar she spent on lawyers and private investigators, all documented in her personal papers, all aimed at finding the sister she never stopped hoping to see again. Davidson closed the Bible with careful reverence, his assessment of the situation clearly complete. "Mrs. Blackwood, your claim to the disputed property appears to be absolutely legitimate, Mr. Thompson. Your development scheme was based on attempting to steal land from its rightful owner." Thompson's last desperate gambit had failed, but the effort had revealed something important about Catherine's preparation and determination. She hadn't simply appeared at Eli's door with vague claims and mysterious knowledge. She'd spent years building an ironclad legal case that could withstand any challenge Thompson or his associates might raise. "How long have you been planning this?" Eli asked quietly. "Since the day I found Sarah's grave and realized I was too late to make amends with the sister I'd lost." Catherine's voice carried the weight of years, spent preparing for a moment she'd hoped would bring reconciliation rather than legal warfare. Every document, every piece of evidence, every legal strategy, all of it designed to honor Sarah's memory by protecting what she wanted to leave behind. The sun had fully risen now, burning away the smoke and shadows that had defined the night's violence. Thompson and his surviving associates were loaded into a wagon for transport to federal custody. Their scheme ended, and their leader facing years in territorial prison. But as Eli watched Catherine carefully return the family Bible to her belongings, he realized that the night's events had been about more than preventing theft or preserving property rights. They'd been about family, lost and found, remembered and honored, extended beyond the boundaries of blood to include people who'd earned the right to belong. "The Bible," he said as Catherine prepared to close her pack. "Sarah would want it displayed in the house. When we rebuild, it should have a place where visitors can see the family history it contains." Catherine's smile was luminous with gratitude and something deeper, the recognition that she'd finally found not just property or legal victory, but home in the truest sense of the word. "Yes," she agreed softly, "and maybe we can add some new entries. Marriages, births, the kind of records that speak of life continuing rather than ending." The words hung between them like a bridge partially built, offering connection but requiring courage to cross completely. As the federal marshals prepared to depart with their prisoners, Eli found himself studying Catherine's face with new understanding. She hadn't come to his door seeking charity or temporary shelter. She'd come seeking family, carrying legal proof of her right to belong and emotional evidence of her commitment to building something lasting from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The family Bible would indeed have a place of honor in whatever house they built together. Its pages testament to love that survived separation, hope that endured disappointment, and faith that some bonds were stronger than time, distance, or the greed of men who mistook property for home. 6 months later, the house stood completed, larger than the original, built with materials that would withstand both prairie storms and human greed. Eli stepped back from the final piece of trim work and surveyed what he and Catherine had accomplished together, feeling a satisfaction deeper than mere construction pride. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the garden where Catherine was teaching 3 young ones, orphans from the nearby reservation, how to distinguish between weeds and the vegetables they'd planted in neat rows. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 10 named David after Catherine's adoptive brother, had shown remarkable aptitude for reading the land and understanding what it needed to flourish. Mr. Eli, the youngest, a girl named Morning Star in honor of her benefactor, came running toward the house with the kind of unbridled enthusiasm that transformed ordinary moments into celebrations. "Miss Catherine says the cradle is ready for the baby room." Eli smiled, his heart full with the kind of contentment he'd thought lost forever. The cradle, carved by his own hands, but finished by Catherine's patient attention to details he'd never mastered, had indeed found its purpose at last. Not for the biological children he and Sarah had never had, but for the chosen family that had grown around their rebuilt home. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face glowing with the particular beauty of a woman who'd found her calling again. She'd resumed her work as a midwife, but with a difference. Now she served not just individual mothers, but entire communities, teaching young women the skills she'd abandoned after her own tragedy. "The baby's coming soon," she said quietly, her hand resting on the gentle swell that had become visible only recently. Dr. Matthews says everything looks perfect. The miracle still seemed impossible to Eli at 61 and 44 respectively. He and Catherine had somehow been blessed with the possibility of biological parenthood. But more than that, they'd created something neither had thought possible, a family that drew its strength from love rather than mere blood relationship. Joseph will want to bless the cradle before the baby arrives. Catherine continued, settling into the porch chair that had become her favorite spot for watching sunset. Paint the prairie in colors that spoke of peace rather than loneliness. The old Lakota elder had become a regular visitor to their rebuilt homestead, bringing with him a steady stream of children who needed homes and adults who needed purpose. What had started as a simple house had evolved into something approaching a small settlement, families connected by choice rather than accident, bound together by shared commitment to making something beautiful from the raw materials of difficult land and harder circumstances. "He's bringing the tribal council next week," Eli said, settling into his own chair beside Catherine's. "Something about formalizing our arrangement for the school." Catherine nodded, her expression bright with anticipation. The school had been her idea, a place where reservation children could learn reading and arithmetic while maintaining connection to their cultural heritage. But it had grown beyond her original vision into something that served the entire region, drawing families from 3 counties who wanted their children educated by people who understood that knowledge came in many forms. "Sarah would be proud," Catherine said softly, her gaze moving across the thriving garden to the small cemetery, where Sarah's headstone now stood, surrounded by carefully tended wildflowers, the same varieties she'd pressed between book pages to preserve their beauty. "She'd be amazed," Eli corrected gently. "I never imagined any of this when I was building that first cabin. Never dreamed it would become home to so many people, so much life." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the eastern horizon, where a familiar group of riders was making its way toward the house. Martha Henley led the procession, her medical bag secured behind her saddle in preparation for the birth that would come within days rather than weeks. Behind her rode Sheriff Davies, no longer territorial marshal but elected local law enforcement, and several families whose children attended Catherine's school. They came bearing food, supplies, and the kind of community support that transformed individual challenges into shared celebrations. "They know," Catherine observed with wonder that hadn't dimmed despite 6 months of such experiences. "Somehow they always know when something important is about to happen. Word travels fast when people care about each other," Eli replied, rising to greet their visitors with the hospitality that had become second nature in their rebuilt life. Martha dismounted with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years answering calls for help at all hours. "How are you feeling, Catherine? Any signs that we should be preparing for immediate arrival?" "Soon, but not tonight," Catherine said with the confidence of someone who'd learned to read her body's signals with professional accuracy. "Maybe tomorrow, certainly within the week." "Good." Martha's expression was satisfied rather than relieved. She'd delivered enough babies to trust maternal instincts about timing. "That gives us time to set up properly. Make sure everything's ready for a smooth delivery." Sheriff Davies approached the porch with the measured steps of someone who carried authority lightly but wore it constantly. "Thought you'd want to know, Thompson was sentenced yesterday. 20 years in federal prison, and his associates got terms ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement." The news was satisfying rather than surprising. Federal justice moved slowly, but with the inexorable weight of mountain avalanches when it finally reached full momentum. "What about the development scheme?" Eli asked, completely collapsed. "Turns out Thompson was using forged documents and embezzled funds for most of his financing. His investors lost everything, and the territorial government is now investigating similar schemes across 3 states. Catherine nodded with grim satisfaction. "Some victories are worth the cost," even when that cost includes sleepless nights and burned houses. As the evening progressed, their visitors settled into the rhythm that had developed around such gatherings: shared meals, quiet conversations, children playing games that seemed to invent themselves from imagination and available materials. The rebuilt house had been designed with community in mind, its large rooms and multiple entrances accommodating the reality that their home had become a gathering place for people who needed connection more than privacy. Later, as the guests prepared to depart for their own homes, Martha pulled Catherine aside for the kind of private conversation that suggested professional rather than social concerns. "The delivery should be straightforward," she said quietly. "But I want you to know, if anything goes wrong, if we have complications, Dr. Matthews and I are both prepared to handle emergency procedures." Catherine's hand moved unconsciously to her silver locket, which now held photographs of her first son, alongside images of the children who'd become part of their extended family. "I'm not afraid," she said softly. "Not anymore. Whatever happens, this baby will be born into more love than any child could need." Martha's smile was warm with understanding. "Sarah would be proud of what you've built here. What you and Eli have created together. We've created what Sarah always dreamed of, a house full of children, land used for growing rather than just holding, purpose that goes beyond mere survival." Catherine's gaze moved to where Eli was helping load the last of the evening's visitors into their wagon. "She gave me the gift of finding him, and he gave me the gift of remembering who I used to be." As the final guests departed, Eli and Catherine stood together on their porch, watching prairie stars emerge in numbers that made city dwellers weep with wonder. The silence around them was no longer empty. It hummed with the potential energy of sleeping children, growing crops, and love that had learned to express itself through daily acts of service rather than desperate clinging to what had been lost. "The cradle's in place," Eli said quietly, his arm encircling Catherine's. Shoulders with the easy familiarity of people who'd learned to move through life as partners rather than individuals, who happened to share space. "Good. And tomorrow we'll start carving another one." Joseph mentioned that 2 families on the reservation are expecting babies this winter. Catherine leaned into his embrace, her contentment evident in the way she'd learned to accept happiness without waiting for the tragedy that might follow. Another cradle. Another chance for life to find a way to flourish despite everything that tries to prevent it. "Sarah's gift keeps giving," Catherine observed softly. "Not just the land or the legal documents, but the example of how to love someone enough to want the best for them, even when you can't provide it yourself." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast darkness above the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack with sounds that spoke of wild freedom and ancient continuity. Closer to home, the settled sounds of domestic life, horses moving in the corral, chickens settling for the night. The soft whisper of wind through growing grain created a symphony of belonging that neither had expected to hear again. The new cradle waited in the room they'd prepared for their coming child, surrounded by evidence of the life they'd built from the ashes of what had been destroyed. It would not remain empty long, and when it was eventually outgrown, it would pass to another family who needed reminding that hope could survive any loss, that love could overcome any separation, and that some things were worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. In his pocket, Eli carried Sarah's ring, not as a burden from the past, but as a reminder of love that had been real and beautiful and worthy of honor. On Catherine's finger, a new ring caught the starlight with promise of love that was equally real, equally beautiful, and worthy of whatever future they could build together. The mountain woman had knocked and said she would give him children. She'd kept her promise in ways neither of them could have imagined, creating family from the raw materials of loss and hope, building home from the foundation stones of memory and possibility. As they finally went inside to prepare for sleep, Catherine paused beside the cradle that would soon fulfill its long-delayed purpose. "Sarah was right about everything," she said softly. "Sometimes the thing you need most does come from the direction you least expect. And sometimes," Eli replied, "the best gifts are the ones that take 20 years to unwrap properly." The house settled around them with the satisfied sounds of a structure built to last for generations, filled with people who understood that home was not a place, but a choice, the daily decision to create something beautiful from whatever materials life provided, whether those materials were love or loss, hope or heartbreak, dreams fulfilled or dreams transformed into something even better than originally imagined. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, but inside, the new cradle waited with the patient certainty of carved wood and loving hands, ready to receive the gift of life that would continue the story Sarah had begun and Catherine had carried forward into a future bright with possibility.